Okay, glad you're here. Nice to see you. I appreciate that you come in here when it's one of our rare sunny days that are left to us. Who's got a joke? Someone roaming around? Come on. Anyone? No one's gonna leap up? Okay. Uh, One a classmate told me at a high school reunion this weekend. Uh, a man comes home and he catches his son masturbating. This is really more appropriate for next week, but we'll do. He catches his son masturbating. Says, son, you can't do that. You got to stop masturbating. Every time you masturbate, your vision gets a little poorer. You're going to go blind if you keep doing that. And the son said, Dad, I'm over here. See, this is why you should have come up with a joke and said, you like it? Okay. So we were talking about things that are seen to be attractive. And we talked earlier about breasts and about breast implants, et cetera. And if you've seen the historical period dramas, there was a time when in Victorian society it was perfectly common for women to wear a bustle that was meant to make their butts look even bigger than they might actually be. And this was seen as being very attractive. And of course, I couldn't help but show, modern trends. And this fascination was so extreme that there was a time in the 1800s, late 1700s, 1800s, when in Europe, there was a woman from Africa who was famous as a sideshow because she had such prominent buttocks. And she was called the Hottentot Venus, Venus as in the goddess of love. And if you want to read a really, really sad story, find out more about her. I give her name there. She apparently was an incredibly talented person. She knew lots of languages. She was very fluent in Dutch as well as the language of I think South Africa, where she came from, and English and French. And so she was taken to Europe and displayed, and people paid money to go behind the screen to see the Hottentot Venus with her buttocks sticking out, etc. And when she died, she was dissected to see, what was different about her backside. And it really sort of brings home how horrible human beings could be, have been, and likely will be again. Then the last topic to talk about is a cool study where they ask when people are looking when women are looking at men, what are they concerned with? Are they paying attention to whether there's a bulge in the pants, which the man maybe will, in a stereotypical fashion, will emphasize by putting a rolled up pair of socks in his underwear, etc. And the answer is no. We'll talk about penis size a bit more later. But I mean, in general, most women are not that concerned about the size of their partner's penis. Obviously, I'm talking about heterosexual couplings here. But men think they are. And we talked about that a little bit before. But in this study, they had straight men and women look at photographs and, and we're asking them to evaluate, how attractive the person was. And it's especially prominent here. And men, even straight men, spent, looked at the face, but also spent some time looking at the crotch, trying to discern somehow maybe how much of genitalia was there. But in fact, women looking at the same photograph, they only concentrated on the face. So it's women don't care about penis size that much in general, but men think they do, and men are certainly concerned about penis size, even if they're straight. And so, and we'll talk about this again in a moment, but gay men are even more interested in general in penis size. So, so one of the things that I like to talk about, and that's because it's so prominent, is that there, in terms of what is sexually attractive, it's really quite different for men and women. And we've alluded to this before. Now that you know what D primes are, um, the biggest sex differences are in things like this: interest in casual sex, interest in visual pornography, and the interest in visual pornography. Basically, you can also, that's about the effect size of interest or concern about penis size. Attraction to older partners, concern about attractiveness and frequency of masturbation. We've talked about all those big sex differences in behavior that dwarf any cognitive sex differences. Yeah. And in terms of trying to weigh looks versus resources, there's a big sex difference there in that women, the number of women who see good looks as essential, less than 1 in 5. Uh, for men, it's more like 2 in 5. And most men, only about 1 in 5 care whether their potential partner has a steady income. And for women, that's much more important than looks, right? So that's the biggest percentage here who say something is essential is women want a partner who has resources. And you can see how that could have an evolutionary history, which doesn't mean that that's what's maintaining it today. There's excellent reasons in our society to want resources. Men and women also vary quite a bit in what sort of sexual fantasy they have. And in general, women are more likely, even straight women are more likely to fantasize about same-sex couplings, for example. And it's clear that there's a big sex difference in how often people have sexual fantasies. The best sort of studies like this are one where you give a bunch of people, it used to be pagers, or have an app that will, at random times in the day, signal them and then ask them to say what they've been thinking about lately. And from that, you can then make an average across subjects like men versus women. And I'm actually kind of surprised. So, and that sort of, it's probably the most reliable analysis because it doesn't require them to think about, well, what do I think I do? Because we people are notoriously poor at that sort of gauging. But it looks like, men about 7 times a day, they're fantasizing about having sex. And women, a little bit less, 4 to 5 times, 4.5 times per day, et cetera. And another way to get at it is probably not quite as accurate, but still gets at the same thing, is to ask someone, have you fantasized about having sex in the last 5 minutes? And there's again another sex difference, and you won't be surprised to learn there's also an age difference, right? So young people are much more likely to have been fantasizing about sex lately than older people. And there's also sex differences in the content of the fantasy. Men are often fantasize about having sex with a partner who is sexually inexperienced. Women are much less likely to let's see. So here, to decode this for you. So males, like more than half of the men reported that they would occasionally fantasize, bless you, about having sex with a virgin. Also, men are more likely to be fantasizing about having more than one partner at a time. Men are much more interested, and these are all among straight men, are much more interested in anal intercourse than women are. So maybe a third of the time, men, maybe 30% of men occasionally fantasize about that. Also being seen, et cetera. So these are all things where these are the sorts of fantasy content that is much more common in men than in women. And although we're not showing it here, in general, uh, gay men are even higher in these percentages than straight men. So that's another way in which gay men do not have under-masculinized brains or under-masculinized minds. If anything, they are hyper-masculine on average. And on the other hand, sex with a much older partner is that too is more common among men than women, and with a much younger partner as well. And men are more interested in fantasizing about masturbating their partners, etc. So these are all things where, in general, men fantasize about them more often than women. And there's some things that are more equal to be fantasizing about touching, kissing, and things like that is more likely. Women are much more likely to fantasize about getting married. And again, these are among straight women. They're much more likely about fantasies of having sex with with another woman, seen in here, and also more likely to fantasize about being the other sex. Questions about all of that. There are also and in general, men are more likely to fantasize about almost every sexual act than women, right? And there's also a big sex difference in interest in where in the body to be stimulated. There are, in general, women are much more interested in having a partner provide them with a foot rub than men are. And there are some women who reportedly can even reach orgasm by having their feet rubbed. And since it's a neuroscience course, I feel like I have to point out that some folks have noticed that because in the somatosensory map, where different parts of somatosensory cortex are receiving information from different parts of the body, you already know it's not it. You can't map a human body onto it in one continuous fashion, so that the hand, for example, is interspersed between the face and the upper arm, which is not where it is physically, but that's how the maps work out, and that the genitalia, sensory information from the genitalia, are reaching the part of somatosensory cortex that's immediately adjacent to the part that receives information from the foot and toes. And so some people speculated that maybe for some people, more likely women than men, stimulating that part of somatosensory cortex spills over and somehow stimulates the neighboring somatosensory cortex interested in genitalia, and so feels like the genitalia are being stimulated. Questions about that? Anyone? There's a long-standing question about whether human beings have pheromones. That is, whether they respond to signals that evolution has come up with that are important for triggering sexual arousal and sexual interest. And a good part of what drives this is the fact that such pheromones are so clearly very important in most mammalian species. And so there's always that question of whether there's such a thing in humans as well. But uh, I have to say, I'm pretty skeptical of the whole idea for several reasons. Number one, in animals have a sensory organ called the vomeronasal organ that is specialized to detect pheromones, and almost exclusively pheromones related to sexual function. And in the old world primates, from which humans and other apes derived, that broke off from the rest of the primates about 25 million years ago, in the common ancestor of all the old world primates, the vomeronasal organ basically disappeared. And so while you can see vestiges of the vomeronasal organ in embryonic humans, there's never any sensory neurons there. And so in humans, there is no vomeronasal organ. And so that was the first reason why people at first were saying, and therefore there can't be pheromones that affect humans. And um, and of course, the people who are primarily promoting the idea that there might be pheromones are those who want to sell you something that you can put on your body, a body uh, cologne or perfume that will somehow trigger some secret mechanism in other people to make them desire you. And so a great deal of money is spent on, and great fortunes are made by people selling products that they claim are pheromones and will, make people be more attracted to you than they normally would. They're always mixed, of course, with things that we can smell, odors, that are considered to be pleasant. But in fact, there's no evidence that they work. There's no evidence that any of those compounds actually make people more sexually aroused or more interested in having sex with you than they did before. On the other hand, if your partner likes that smell, then that's reason enough to wear it, but they're not going to be stimulating any pheromones. How's that? And that used to be the end of it, but now I have to add a coda to that sort of thing, because in mice, for example, that have been best studied, there is indeed a vomeronasal organ, and it is separate from the olfactory epithelium that we do share with the other mammals. And a peculiar thing is that when researchers managed to genetically stop the vomeronasal organ from working, some pheromones still have an effect on mice. So the old idea that in mice, pheromones acted only on the vomeronasal organ and not on the olfactory epithelium, and that the olfactory epithelium was important for only detecting other sorts of odors and not pheromones, that dichotomy got broken down. It's clearly not entirely the case. So that means that if humans are responding to pheromones, if mice can respond to pheromones on their olfactory epithelium, then maybe humans can respond to pheromones on their olfactory epithelium. But as I say, when people use, blind placebo-controlled studies, no one's found any evidence of any pheromones that are more likely to make men or women more sexually aroused. Questions about that? So if you're wearing and yeah, and in other mammals that have vomeronasal organs, it's clear that the vomeronasal organ has a very powerful effect on guiding sexual behaviors and makes same-sex sexual behavior much less common than opposite-sex sexual behavior. And maybe later I'll talk about what the evolutionary significance of that might be. The other thing, talking about pheromones in humans, is there's a study that was done by a very talented and brilliant woman, Martha McClintock, when she was an undergraduate at Harvard, and one of the first women to be admitted into Harvard. She published a paper in Nature that provided evidence that women who were living together were more likely to have their menstrual cycles in synchrony with one another, and she suggested that pheromones could be at work. One of the things that was compelling about this hypothesis was that she reported that synchrony was much more likely among those women living in a house if they spent a lot of time with each other. And she even suggested that there might be emotional ties that make them more likely to be swapping these pheromones, and that might make it more likely that they would start their menses on the same time. It's a wonderful hypothesis. It's totally gotten into the mass culture, but it has not held up well over the years. So when people try to test this idea, it turns out that the mathematics of deciding when two women are or are not in synchrony it turns out calculating the mathematical odds of that happening by chance alone are not so easy, especially if you say, well, if they start their period within 2 days of each other, and then how many cycles would they have to have that happen when one woman might have a longer cycle than the other, et cetera. And so other people looking at those data have really concluded that there's no evidence that women living together synchronize their menstrual cycles. So it's a beautiful idea that doesn't seem to have held up. Don't worry, Dr. McClintock had a long and brilliant and extremely productive career as a scientist at the University of Chicago. So she had plenty of other important findings. But I don't mean to malign her. Question: how many of you had heard that idea that women that are close to it have? Yeah, I mean it's a great idea, right? But then there's the question of whether women vary across their menstrual cycle in terms of their interest in having sex. And so I guess I'll just go back to say that I don't actually have a good graphic to show you about this. We know from the ovulatory cycle that there's a certain part of the ovulatory cycle where a woman is much more likely to get pregnant if she has sex than others. So sex during menses itself is very unlikely to result in any pregnancy. And the prime time for gathering sperm to make it most likely to get pregnant is in those days just before ovulation per se takes place. And gathering sperm the day after ovulation is a total waste of time, because after the day of ovulation, if you gather sex the next day, by then the egg will travel too far down the oviduct and therefore won't get fertilized in time to develop enough to implant in the endometrium of the uterus, something we talked about a couple of times before. Well, with that big signal about when's the best time to get pregnant, and with hormones driving all that, and we know that hormones have plenty of targets in the brain, the hypothesis has been that women are much more likely to seek sex during their fertile period of the cycle than not fertile cycle. And this is another instance where it's been problematic to evaluate the data, where, I mean, how close to the period of ovulation do you say this is the fertile period, and so, this is when you expect more sex than not? And it's also complicated by the fact that in our society, a woman isn't the only one that decides whether she's going to have sex, right? There's a partner involved. And yeah, I know the stereotype is the guy's always ready to have sex, but, the reality might be a little bit different. Also, for a lot of women, it's not, even if there is some effect of hormones on their feelings of libido, there are plenty of other things that affect their libido too, like how close do they feel to the partner, or how appreciated they feel by the partner, et cetera. And so it's all, pretty complicated. And in an interesting way, some of the strongest data suggest that women are more likely to seek sexual relations during their fertility period are in studies among lesbian couples, where it's not as tied to other concerns. There's no interest in getting pregnant, right? Because that's not the goal. But and I'm not making you go through all that data, but I would say you look at it overall, there is a slight increase in libido in women on average around the time of their that they're ovulating, which is to say during the during the follicular phase, just before the day of ovulation. And on average, the day of ovulation happens in the midpoint of the menstrual cycle. So we're talking a couple weeks after the end of the previous menses. People have also tried to look at whether men can detect whether women are in their fertility cycle. And in this study that got a lot of press, and as far as I know, it hasn't been um, either replicated or disproven. They were looking at exotic dancers who are dancing in front of men and who earn most of their money by having the men provide them with money in the way of, sticking dollar bills in their underwear, et cetera, as they're dancing around. And in one study, at least, they looked at normally cycling women who were working in this way, and they found that the amount of money they earned was highest about the time when gathering sperm would be most likely to result in pregnancy, and was quite low at other times. And the other point they used in trying to emphasize this point is there was a natural control available of those exotic dancers who were on the birth control pill, whose hormone levels are absolutely flat. And what they noted was that there was no such peak in these women. And so they suggested that maybe something was going on here in that. Well, one hypothesis is that the men could detect those women based on their movements or something about what they were doing, could detect when they might be fertile, and that made them more attractive to the men, and therefore they tip more. Everyone get the idea? What's the alternative? Yeah. Oh, it's there. One is, how do we know whether is it the woman who's behaving differently because of where she is, or is it the men who are detecting something, right? And of course, those aren't exclusive, but that's another possibility. Any other hypotheses? Yeah, good. Ah, I love that idea that the men just got their paycheck. Yeah. Um, Actually, I quite like the idea, but as far as I know, this was a varied group of men, and so they'd probably be on different pay cycles. And also, um, since there's no menstrual synchrony, you'd expect that when one particular menstrual exotic dancer is at her peak, the other women aren't. That would be, yeah. And of course, the fact that it's not seen in the women who are on the pill, that suggests that the woman's hormones that are in circulation play some role either in what men are, but uh, excuse me, but doesn't prove it. There is one thing we know about human libido that is undeniable, and that is testosterone increases in circulation, increases human libido in both sexes. And we've seen lots of cases to show that. Number one, it turns out while most boys will have their first crush before puberty, maybe, typically before 10 years of age, uh, boys' interest in sex and interest in masturbation typically is tied pretty closely to the arrival of puberty when testosterone levels rise. And in both boys and girls, people have seen a correlation between when the testosterone arrives and when the interest in sex appears, as since there's a big sex difference in the amount of testosterone, it seems pretty likely that in both sexes, only a little bit of testosterone is needed to increase libido. And another instance that suggests that, when we talk about those men who have no GnRH and therefore puberty never quite comes, they just keep growing taller, and their beard never comes in, their pubic hair may or may not come in, their voices don't deepen, etc. Uh, those men typically are not that interested in dating or in girls. And then when they go to the doctor and start getting testosterone, their libido returns. And so it's pretty clear that testosterone is important for that. I think earlier I showed you that women who are undergoing menopause and complain about a loss of libido at that point. Giving ovarian hormones like estrogen, progesterone don't do anything for their libido, but giving them a small amount of testosterone does have an effect, at least for some women, and on average. And finally, in double-blind, placebo-controlled studies of giving testosterone to men who have lost their testes for one reason or another, either accident or surgery, it's clear that their libido is higher when they're getting testosterone and lower when they're not. Oops, forgot I had that. What's interesting is that both in animals and people, the amount of testosterone needed to fully restore libido is tiny. So in this classic study, back before they could measure hormones, they took a bunch of guinea pigs, male guinea pigs, and if you've been around guinea pigs, you might be surprised, but they actually do have sex. And that's why we still have guinea pigs. And they gave male guinea pigs tests with different partners and found that some males like to copulate a lot, some not so much, and some in between. And so they studied a bunch of guinea pigs and classified them, and those that had high drive, medium drive, or low drive. And then they castrated them. And that then provides the other good reason to think testosterone is something to do with sexual drive, because within a week or two after castration, everybody stopped copulating. And that's something that's been seen across virtually every mammalian species and many avian species as well. If there's no testosterone around at all, they will not copulate. Even though they couldn't measure androgens in those days, synthetic androgens were available, and they found that when they gave a low dose of testosterone, the animals began copulating again. It takes about a week or so for them to start. But when that happened, those who had copulated a lot before copulated a lot. Those that had copulated very little still had a low drive, and the others were in between. And this despite the fact they were all getting exactly the same amount of testosterone. At that point, they tried doubling the dose to give them a high dose to see if that would make everybody, a new Casanova, and it was utterly without effect. In fact, if anything, increasing the dose may have depressed libido in all the groups, but the difference between them was still there. And therefore, and this fits very well with studies people tried for a long time of seeing whether there's some correlation between men who show a lot more sex drive than others and how much testosterone they have. And the answer is no, there's no such correlation. You can't explain why some men want to copulate a lot more than others based on their testosterone levels. In animals, it's also clear that very low doses of testosterone are enough to fully restore libido. So I think I mentioned this before. In rats and mice, investigators found that if you provided just enough testosterone so that was 1/10 the level that the males normally get exposed to, that was enough to totally restore their copulatory behavior, which fits in pretty well with the idea that giving women a low dose testosterone provides the maximum effect on their libido. In other words, it looks like when testosterone is being produced, only a little of it is needed to fully restore interest in sexual behavior, and that the additional testosterone is there for other purposes, right? Helping sperm mature, making muscles big, stuff like that. We also knew for a long time that that men who lost their testes would lose interest. I think I've talked about this before. We know, as from the oldest recorded history we have, that people have understood that castrating men changes their behavior. We know from archaeological sites that it was pretty common for conquering armies to, if they didn't kill all the men, to at least castrate them all. And it was well known that in those circumstances, the men would lose some of their strength, physical strength, and also be less aggressive. And of course, that had been understood from animal husbandry, where castrating bulls would, especially if you did it early in life, would make them less likely to be aggressive in adulthood. And as Aristotle talked about how to castrate um, cockerels to make capons, and in those cases where men managed to gather large numbers of sexual partners, it was not uncommon, described in the Bible and in the Middle East and other places and in China. It was not uncommon for them to also use eunuchs, men who had been castrated, to look after the harem, with the idea that the men wouldn't be capable of inseminating and impregnating the women. So, I've mentioned this before too. The Bible says Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. And, and it was clear that that was seen. And it's clear that that's being described as giving you evidence of what a powerful and a powerful monarch he was and how much resources he had, that he could have that many, keep and take care of that many partners. And it also describes several instances of eunuchs in the Bible. The idea that the eunuchs weren't having sex with the women in the harem is probably a mistake. We know in at least some cases, those men, even though they didn't have testes, were still interested in having sex and sometimes had sex with women in the harem. But of course, without testes, there was no way they could impregnate those women. Questions about that? So it brings us to one time in history where males were deliberately castrated, not to punish them, but to, in a sense, help them. And that's the so-called castrati. So a strange thing was happening in Europe in the Middle Ages, where the Catholic Church deemed that women should never speak in church and should not be allowed to sing in church. And at the same time, there was a surgence of interest in music and choral music. And that meant that it was very difficult to have many voices in the higher range. One solution around that, of course, is to have within the chorus young boys, right? Still male, so still allowed to speak and sing in church and provide that high register. But of course, as the boys got older and puberty came, their so-called voice breaking meant that they would have a lowering of their voice. And we don't know who first came up with the idea, but eventually people realized that if they were to take boys, and especially boys who had a good ear, who could carry a tune, etc., if they were castrated before their voice had broke, they would maintain that high register and they would continue to grow, but their voices wouldn't be lower. And if they were musically gifted, then they could provide, they could provide choral music that would be to the greater good of God, right? And so estimates are in Italy, where it was probably most popular to do this, that there was as many as 4,000 boys a year were castrated. Often they came from the lower classes, where someone from the church would come to the family and say, your son has a good musical ear. We want him for the church. And they might either volunteer the son, or the church might even pay them to let them take the boy into their care, be castrated, and then have a livelihood. That might sound harsh that parents would do that, but in a situation where you don't know, where no one ever gets to eat as much as they want, again, among the lower classes, and where you don't know what tomorrow may bring, the advantage of that was that you knew your child would, have a place to live, would be well fed. The church had plenty of resources, especially for the people that were that it used for worship, etc. And so it became quite popular. There was also some of those boys those castrati, would leave the church, leave religious singing, and this was also happening at a time when opera was rising in Italy and was an incredibly popular pastime. And so there were several famous castrati who were the stars of their day. They were the rock stars of that era. And there were several things that made castrati stand out. Number one, because they were castrated before puberty, they tended to be tall for the same reasons we've talked about before. They didn't have those gonadal steroids to fuse the tall bones of the long bones of the body very as early as they would have otherwise. They tended to have smooth chins and faces, of course. They were very unlikely to go bald, right? So even if they got the gene for male pattern baldness without the testosterone coming, they wouldn't do that. And it's clear that this fellow, for example, Farinelli, he was famous. People would come from miles around and pay huge sums of money to hear him sing. And one interesting aspect of the castrati is because they tended to be tall and big, not only did they have a high register, but they could still project loudly because they had big rib cages, big diaphragm. And of course, before there's amplified music, you can imagine how important it is that the person on the stage can be heard in the balcony way up there where those people also paid to hear him. And when he would sing, the audiences would sometimes call out, "Long live the knife," meaning, the one that castrated him to make such things. And it's not entirely, here's another, there are lots of paintings of him done at the time. He was so popular. It's clear, too, that he had sex with women. We don't know the details of what kind of sex, but he had groupies and he had lots of women, upper class women, of course, but those are the ones that had access to opera, who had affairs with him. And it's not easy to know what they sounded like because from descriptions at the time, it was clear they didn't sound like boys and they didn't sound like men and they didn't sound like women. And so we don't really know what they sound like. And the idea or the practice of castrati kind of petered out in the 1800s. So, but here is a photograph of some people that sang for the church. And can you pick out who the castrati are? So this gentleman, was he a castrati? No. How about this guy? No. How about this guy with the great mustache? No. But this gentleman? Yeah. This gentleman? Yeah. This one? And I believe this fellow Maresci actually lived long enough that his voice was recorded. So there are recordings of it. But you got to remember that audio recording technology was really pretty crummy. I'm going to play you, but someone put out a CD where someone recorded several songs, him singing. They're scratchy, the tone's not great, etc. And it's, the music he was used to singing, choral music for the church. So I'll give you an example in a bit. And another instance of someone whose voice, who did without testosterone during a crucial period of their life. This is probably a case of someone who had idiopathic gonadal dysgenesis, where something happened to him at age 37, but until then, he had a short stature, no beard, etc., but he had a great ear and a great voice. And so he was an incredibly popular jazz singer and known as Little Jimmy Scott. And we don't know what happened at age 37, that suddenly he had a growth spurt and his voice changed a little bit, but it remained mostly in the high register. And what's interesting is somewhere in that time, he stopped getting gigs in music and eventually was working as a janitor at a hospital, I think in Cleveland, somewhere like that, and kind of got rediscovered by folks. And so late in life, had a return of his career. So let's see what they Just want to make sure I don't have another. Yeah. So let's see what they sounded like. So here, uh, we can, here's a recording of Alessandro Moreschi, the last castrati. As far as we know, the only castrati who ever had his voice recorded, because the practice gone. Couple of things. It's towards the end of his, number one, he was never a particularly talented castrati, even when he was a young man. Number two, he's old by the time these recordings are happening, towards the end of his life. Um, and and of course, it's not our kind of music, right? I mean, it's the music that he earned his living singing for the church. A little more mellifluous, little Jimmy Scott. Now, if I hadn't introduced it this way and I said, which one of the two people there displayed on the album cover is singing, I predict you would have had a difficult time telling me which it was. That doesn't sound like a woman. And it sure doesn't sound like a man either. And even if you don't like jazz, I mean, at least the recording quality is good. And it's clear that he had a great ear. Questions about any of this, Castrati or the like? I think we can probably regard him as an accidental castrati. So I'm going to go quickly through this because we have talked about it before. The Masters and Johnson's model of human sexual response, where individuals first at the beginning of sexual relations reach excitement and reach a plateau. And for most people, they try to maintain their presence at that plateau experience as long as possible, and then have an orgasm. And in most men and most women, after an orgasm, there's a gradual decline in sexual excitement called the resolution phase. And in some women, there might be multiple orgasms before they have a resolution phase. For most men, after an orgasm, there's a period where the erection goes away and they can't get enough stimulation to reach orgasm again. And so we call that the refractory period. And what I like about this chart is there are many women who, when they have sex, they reach the plateau phase, which they very much enjoy and get great satisfaction from. But there are some women who never actually have an orgasm, so they're anorgasmic, and yet still they are interested in having sex with their partners and find it fulfilling, etc. And that model, I mean, what's interesting about the model is that there's no one particular measure that they're using here, but it more or less mimics what you see if you look at heart rate or respiratory rate, things like that. And there are also, in these phases, excitement, plateau, orgasm, and resolution, there are physiological changes that were also first marked by Masters and Johnson in their lab in St. Louis. And during the excitement phase, the walls of the vagina exude lubrication, and the uterus sometimes rises within the body cavity. During plateau, the walls of the vagina tend to swell and therefore somewhat constricts the inner part of the vagina itself. And there may also be a contraction of the clitoris under the hood, which paradoxically may make it more difficult to stimulate the clitoris. But of course, with a willing partner and some ingenuity and some thinking, that can still happen, because for most women, stimulation of the clitoris will be required for them to reach orgasm. And so during that phase, there'll be that rhythmic contractions of the muscles of the pelvic girdle, of the pelvic floor that we've talked about before. And that may also be seen in autonomic guided constriction of the uterus and the vagina. And then during resolution, things kind of return back to the position that they were in before. But if they have another bout of sex, that can all repeat. And for those women that have ejaculation, it's pretty clear it's mostly from the bladder, but this is not, terribly rare. There are plenty of women that do have an ejaculate. In men, things look about like, it, and I should say that the appeal of the Masters and Johnson model is that it seems to apply pretty well to both sexes. So during the excitement phase, there are all clear is when the erection is beginning, and during the plateau, there's usually full erection, and there might be some secretion at the tip of the penis, so that clear kind of astringent fluid that's sometimes called as pre-cum, and it's probably coming from the bulbourethral glands, or also known as Cowper's glands, that is immediately connected to the inside of the urethra there next to the prostate. During orgasm, again, the muscles of the pelvic girdle and pelvic floor contract rhythmically in a way that's not usually under conscious control, although if a man tries hard enough, he may be able to constrict those muscles to keep that somewhat reduced. There'll be totally outside of his control will be rhythmic contractions and peristalsis in the vas deferens. It's getting sperm from the epididymis to the mixing chamber to go out, but it will be the rhythmic contractions of the muscles of the pelvic floor that will add to and cause the spurts of ejaculate that come out. And then with resolution, all those things go back to the way they were before. Questions about that? Next chapter, we talk about various sexual positions and sexual behaviors, etc. So we'll return to this then. And the orgasm gap. I said before, some women never have an orgasm, and that's much more common in men than in women. And there are things that can increase or decrease the chance of having orgasm, and they're somewhat different for men and women. So here we're looking at being with a familiar partner. Men, most of the time, will reach an orgasm, and so will women. With a new partner, men are not as likely to reach an orgasm. Number one, we'll talk a couple of weeks. There might not be an erection to allow orgasm, or etc. And women are much less likely to reach orgasm when they have a new partner as opposed to a familiar partner. And that's, suggesting that for women, it isn't just a matter of the stimulation, certainly not the size of the penis or things like that. It really is one of the things that will go into her sense of libido and excitement isn't, what hormones she has, but it is how they're feeling about their partner at the time. And the good news is that almost everybody can reach orgasm if they masturbate, including most women. And so notice that women are more likely to reach orgasm if they masturbate than even if with a familiar partner. This doesn't mean that the women aren't satisfied by and derive enjoyment from having an orgasm with their partner, but it does suggest that this suggests that most women can reach orgasm, and it makes you wonder if eventually, in fact, any woman could reach orgasm, and that it's just a matter of, the right sort of stimulation and the right sort of mental composition. Questions about that? And when we talk about sexual behavior later, um, for women, whatever sort of sexual behavior you're involved in, it's probably pretty important to make sure there's plenty of lubrication and that there's stimulation of the clitoris. And if her partner is concerned about her reaching orgasm, those need to be concerns that he has as well. The book talks about how people have looked at which parts of the brain are active during sexual arousal um, and orgasm. So these things like this, and I have to tell you, I don't think they tell us anything except, you know what, when you're having an orgasm, the brain's active, right? Anyone, and did anyone think that might not have been the case? Um, so I'm gonna skip over that, and I'm gonna. We've talked about this before, that there are plenty of bisexual men, and I've already shown this graph that non-gender conforming boys tend to grow up to be gay. The other new thing that I want to talk about is that um, gay people may show a mix of gender typical and gender atypical traits. So I mentioned this before when I said gay men, for example, are hypermasculine in terms of those sex differences in sexual attitude that we talked about: interest in visual pornography, interest in multiple partners, interest in younger partners, etc. Um, but um, but on the other hand, they're different from straight men in terms of who they want to have sex with. And in general, lesbians may have cognitive differences from straight women in some ways, but will be very female typical in others, and yet they're attracted to women, not men. One interesting, at least to me, sex difference is in throwing accuracy. And this is one where, again, there's no way of knowing whether the fact that boys are encouraged to play sports that use balls, etc., make them more accurate. But there's a big sex difference in the number of errors of straight men versus straight women. And gay women tend to be somewhat masculinized in this regard, and gay men tend to be somewhat feminized in this regard. And, going the wrong way. And then in terms of verbal fluency, in general, straight women are more verbally fluent than straight men, and lesbians are less verbally fluent than straight women, and gay men are more verbally fluent. And these are all, it's not clear how many of these traits have something to do with something essential about the sexual orientation, or simply reflecting differences in social and cultural stimulation. The last thing I want to talk about in this chapter, and I do want to have time to get to it, is this pretty pernicious myth that has been out there a long time and still occasionally arises. This idea that where the gay men arise because they've been molested by a gay man as a child. So it's complicated, and it's also, pretty nuanced. So what is true is that boys who report having been molested, verbal fluency. Yeah, so verbal refers to language. So it can be either oral or written. So some people think verbal means spoken, but that's not the case. Verbal is language. And verbal fluency, as in on those college achievement tests, on average, women score higher on tests of verbal fluency than men on those sorts of things. And people have used other tests to see that women are more likely to be able to come up with a lot of words in in one of those games where here's some letters, and how many words can you make using those letters in a reduced amount of time, and things like that. So on average, women are better at those sorts of tasks than men. And going back to the Baby X experiments, you have to wonder, well, has this got something to do with the fact that when they were babies, they were more likely to be talked to, spoken to, and looked at, etc.? Is it a result of a lifetime of being encouraged to be more involved in communication? Or is it reflecting something deeper than that? If anything, the fact that lesbians are somewhat masculinized in that regard, and that gay men are much more feminine in that regard, suggests that there might be something more to it than how they were treated as children. Did that? You're so far so good? Okay. What's pernicious about this idea of gay men arise from other gay men, the idea that the molestation theory, that if a gay man has sex with a boy, that will mean the boy's more likely to be gay when they grow up, is, of course, that's been used for centuries as a way of persecuting and sometimes killing gay men to protect them from children. And it's only been recently here in the United States that until recently in the United States, most school districts would not hire a gay man because the idea was that gay man being around children might molest some of the boys and make them gay too. So that was part of the stigma of attached to gay men. So here's what makes discussing it tricky, is that in general, gay men, when they think back in life, seem to show more interest in sex than straight men at the same age. So, and you maybe see that as just a reflection of the fact that they're more interested in sex when they grow up, right? Gay men are more interested in visual pornography, more interested in multiple partners, more interested in sex, etc. So it could be that they were different as children before they ever encountered any adults that might be interested in having sex with them. So they're also more sexually active. And then the other thing to say against the molestation theory is the vast majority of gay men were never molested as children. And so where do they come from? If they were never molested as children and they're still gay today, how can you support the idea that that's the cause? And the other thing that's works against that is most gay people, when you talk to them, will tell you even those gay people who were molested as children, did have sex with adults as children, they'll tell you that they were interested in sex, and typically interested in sex with men before they ever had that experience. So all of this is to sort of help you deal with this graph where we're looking at the percentage who identify as homosexual or bisexual. And there are those who were not molested, the vast majority of people. And if we look at males and females, right, most those females do not grow up to be lesbians. And, pardon me, most women do not grow up to be lesbians, right? But if we look at those that were molested, among the males, they are much more likely to be homosexual than those who are not touched as a child. But notice the scale. This is only like 7.5%. So it doesn't account for the vast majority of gay men. And so it seems entirely possible that the fact that they were more likely to be gay may be that that gay children are more likely to be molested than straight children, and that they were gay first and the molestation happened second. And of course, most of them never were molested. And again, most women who are molested as a child, they are more likely to be lesbians than the general population, but the vast majority of them, 97% here, turn out to be straight. And maybe I quoted this before. There's a great memoir by never mind. A great memoir called Bastard Out of Carolina, where the woman talks about being molested by her mother's partner as a child, and Dorothy Allison, and she happens to be a lesbian. And a reporter asked her, "Well, so you think being molested as a child makes girls more likely to be lesbians?" And she laughed and said, "Well, certainly not, because there'd be a lot more lesbians if that was the case. Because of course there are a lot more girls that are molested than there are lesbians." Questions about that? All right, let's have another Kahoot then.